In a hidden annex behind a movable bookcase, a small, quiet world existed. A world of whispered conversations, rationed food, and a young girl's diary filled with hopes for a future that would never come. This is the story of that life in the shadows, and the heartbreaking moment the light of a singular voice was tragically extinguished. A voice that has outlived the very machinery designed to silence it, yet still asks us to remember not just her words, but the cruelty of the world that cut them short. This is not only the story of Anne Frank, it is the story of how the Nazis murdered her, and with her, millions of others whose voices we will never hear.
The Diary of Anne Frank remains one of the most widely read books in the world. It is the diary of a child, written between the ages of 13 and 15. Yet it has become more than a personal journal. It is a historical artifact, a window into both ordinary adolescence and extraordinary terror. Anne was not a soldier, not a politician, not even a young woman allowed to grow into adulthood. She was a teenager who dreamed of becoming a writer, who longed for freedom, who wrote of first love and of quarrels with her mother. Her words are filled with light. And yet, her end came in darkness. Behind her story lies a question too painful, yet necessary, to confront. How did the Nazis murder Anne Frank? Not simply in the biological sense of death by disease in Bergen-Belsen, but in the systemic, deliberate dismantling of her life, her family, her childhood, and her future. To answer that question, we must trace her path. Not only as the world knows it, through the pages of her diary, but through the wider machinery of Nazi persecution. From the streets of Amsterdam to the cattle cars bound for Auschwitz, from the suffocating silence of the annex to the screaming chaos of Bergen-Belsen, Anne Frank's story reveals both the fragility of life and the brutal efficiency of a regime determined to erase it. Her voice endures not because she lived, but because she was silenced. And in that silence, history itself demands we listen. This film will investigate the full journey, Anne's early childhood in Frankfurt, the family's escape to the Netherlands, the descent of Amsterdam under Nazi occupation, the years spent hidden behind a bookcase, the betrayal that led to their capture, and finally, the camps that devoured her and her sister. What happened to Anne Frank was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions, made by governments, neighbors, guards, and bystanders. The tragedy of Anne Frank is not only her death, but the lesson that millions of others met the same fate, often without leaving behind a single word. Anne Frank's diary became her voice. But her death is her testimony. And so we begin, not at the end, but at the beginning, with a little girl, her family, and a world that would soon vanish forever. To understand Anne Frank, we must begin long before the annex. Before the bookcase that hid her family, before the diary that made her immortal. We begin in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, in the spring of 1929, the year Anne Frank was born. Anne was born into a family of middle-class German Jews. Her father, Otto Frank, was a decorated officer in the German army during the First World War. He was educated, thoughtful, and deeply devoted to his family. Her mother, Edith, was raised in a devout household, gentle and warm. Anne's older sister, Margot, born 3 years earlier, was studious, serious, and admired by everyone who knew her. The Franks lived in a respectable neighborhood, surrounded by friends and relatives. Anne's earliest years were defined not by fear, but by comfort, days spent in play, in laughter, in the safety of family. But beyond their small world, Germany was changing. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power. The Nazi regime was swift in turning centuries of anti-Semitism into state policy. Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat in the First World War, for its economic collapse, for every humiliation the nation endured. The world Anne was born into would not survive her childhood. By the time Anne was 4 years old, the warning signs were clear. Jewish shops were boycotted. Books written by Jewish authors were burned in public squares. Former neighbors and acquaintances suddenly turned their eyes away. For the Franks, as for many Jews, the message was unmistakable: there was no future in Germany. In 1933, Otto Frank made a decision that would shape the course of his family's life. He left his successful career behind and moved his family to Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. Amsterdam seemed a refuge. The city had a long tradition of tolerance, and the Franks hoped it would offer safety. Here, Anne began school. She quickly made friends and showed signs of her spirited, outgoing nature. Margot excelled academically, quiet and diligent, while Anne was lively, outspoken, and endlessly curious. The family built a new life, though never fully free of the shadows left behind in Germany. By 1940, Anne was 11 years old. She had grown into a child who loved stories, adored movie stars, and dreamed of one day becoming a writer. But even in the safety of Amsterdam, danger was closing in. In May 1940, the German army invaded the Netherlands. The Blitzkrieg was swift, crushing Dutch defenses in a matter of days. Nazi flags soon flew over Amsterdam. The Franks had fled once before. This time, there would be nowhere left to run. The childhood Anne had known of playgrounds, birthdays, and carefree school days was over. What followed was a steady narrowing of her world, until it finally shrank to the four walls of a hidden annex, where her words became her only means of escape. In May of 1940, the German army marched into the Netherlands. For the Dutch, the occupation would last 5 long years. For Anne Frank and her family, it would mean the slow suffocation of freedom, one decree at a time. At first, life in Amsterdam did not change overnight. The city still bustled with bicycles, canals, and crowded markets. Children still went to school, and cafes remained open. But beneath the surface, the German grip tightened with every passing month. New laws singled out the Jews. At first, restrictions seemed almost administrative. Jewish-owned businesses had to be registered. Public offices demanded identification papers stamped with the word Jud, Jew. Soon, the walls grew closer. Jews were barred from certain professions, forced to hand over radios, banned from theaters and cinemas. They could not ride bicycles, could not use trams, could not enter parks. Then came the yellow star, sewn onto every coat. Overnight, Anne, Margot, and their parents became visible targets on the streets they once walked freely. Anne wrote later of this experience with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She was a young teenager, suddenly marked by a symbol that divided her from her friends, her classmates, her city. By 1941, Jewish children were forced out of public schools. Margot and Anne were transferred to the Jewish Lyceum, where lessons were delivered in cramped classrooms filled with children who had been expelled from their former schools. Each law chipped away at normal life, until nothing ordinary remained. What had once been freedoms, walking to the park, buying bread, riding a bicycle, became forbidden acts. The Frank family, like thousands of other Jews in Amsterdam, lived under constant surveillance, aware that each day could bring a knock at the door. Otto Frank had already begun preparing. A thoughtful and cautious man, he foresaw the danger that many still tried to deny. By 1942, with deportations of Dutch Jews underway, he finalized plans for a hiding place above his business premises on Prinsengracht 263. It was meant to be temporary, a refuge until the war ended. No one could know it would stretch into years. On June 12, 1942, Anne celebrated her 13th birthday. Among the gifts was a small red and white checkered diary. She named it Kitty. In it, she poured her secrets, frustrations, and dreams. Just weeks later, that diary would become her lifeline. On July 5, 1942, the family received a call-up notice for Margot Frank. She was ordered to report for labor service in Germany. Everyone knew what that meant: deportation, and almost certain death. The very next morning, the Franks vanished from sight. Leaving behind their apartment, their neighbors, and their former lives, they disappeared into the shadows of the secret annex. And Frank had just turned 13. She carried with her a fountain pen, her thoughts, and a diary that would bear witness to both her inner world and the collapse of the one around her. Behind the swinging bookcase at 263 Prinsengracht, a hidden world came into existence. It was a space of narrow staircases, low ceilings, and shuttered windows. Here, 8 people would live for more than 2 years, unseen, unheard, and unknown to the outside world. The secret annex was small. At its core were the Frank family: Otto, Edith, Margot, and Anne. Soon they were joined by Herman and Auguste van Pels, their son Peter, and later Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist. 8 lives bound together in secrecy. By day, silence was survival. The annex was directly above Otto Frank's business offices. Any sound, footsteps, whispers, the scrape of a chair, might be heard below. During working hours, they moved quietly, like shadows, their lives compressed into silence. At night, life resumed in hushed tones. Small meals were shared. Conversations carried the weight of confinement, frustrations, and fear. And always, there was the dread of discovery, the knowledge that discovery meant deportation. Food was rationed, smuggled in by their helpers: Miep Gies, Bep Vosquitchel, Johannes Kleiman, and Victor Kugler. These 4 risked their lives daily, bringing bread, news, and hope. Without them, survival would have been impossible. For Anne, the annex was both a prison and a canvas. With her diary, she gave life to her world. She wrote of quarrels with her mother, of admiration for her father, of the growing bond with Peter, of her dreams of one day writing for the world to read. Her words captured the claustrophobia of confinement. We have to whisper and tread lightly during the day, otherwise the people in the warehouse might hear us. Whatever we do, we are very afraid the neighbors might hear or see us. We are afraid that the whole world might discover us. But amid fear, Anne's reflections showed remarkable resilience. She wrote of nature glimpsed through the attic window, of her longing for freedom, of her belief in humanity's goodness, even as she hid from humanity's cruelty. The annex was not simply walls and rooms. It was a fragile world suspended between life and death, where a teenager's voice grew louder with each passing day, even as the outside world sought to silence her forever. For 2 years, they endured. Birthdays passed quietly. Holidays were marked in whispers. The war outside raged on, Allied bombings shook the city, deportations emptied Jewish neighborhoods. Yet in the annex, life continued in its fragile rhythm. Anne's diary chronicled not only survival, but transformation. She entered hiding as a girl of 13. By the time of her arrest, she was 15, a young woman whose words had matured into wisdom beyond her years. But the walls of the annex could not hold back the tide of history. In August of 1944, their silence was broken. The bookcase was open. Their world, once hidden, was violently exposed. On the morning of August 4, 1944, the fragile silence of the annex was shattered. The bookcase swung open, not to reveal sanctuary, but to expose its secret to the very forces it had been built to resist. For more than 2 years, the Franks and their companions had remained hidden, protected by secrecy and the courage of their helpers. But that morning, their world collapsed in a single moment. Nazi officers, accompanied by Dutch police, stormed the annex. The 8 inhabitants were taken into custody, along with 2 of their helpers. Meet Geese, the devoted secretary who had supplied them with food and encouragement, was spared. She would later retrieve and scattered writings from the floor, preserving the words the Nazis tried to erase. The betrayal remains one of the great unanswered questions of Anne Frank's story. Who revealed their hiding place? Historians have debated the possibilities for decades. Some point to a warehouse worker suspicious of the unusual silence in the building. Others suspect a Dutch informer motivated by money or ideology. What is certain is this: someone knew, and someone told. The arrest was swift and merciless. The inhabitants were taken first to a police station, then transferred to an Amsterdam prison. Their years of endurance, their hopes of survival, ended in handcuffs and fear. Within days, they were sent to Westerbork transit camp, the gateway to death for more than 100,000 Dutch Jews. At Westerbork, the Frank family and their companions joined the endless tide of deportees, faces marked by exhaustion, eyes hollow from fear. Anne, only 15 years old, still carried her resilience. Witnesses recalled her spirit, her attempts to encourage others, even amid despair. But the annex was gone. The diary, hidden in a drawer, was gone from her hands. And the machinery of the Holocaust had taken hold. The betrayal of the annex was not only the exposure of 8 lives. It was the destruction of a fragile world built on hope, shattered by indifference, and consumed by a system designed for annihilation. For Anne Frank, the next chapter of her journey would no longer be written in her diary. It would be written in the camps. After their arrest, the residents of the annex were transported not across borders, but only a short distance within the Netherlands. Their destination was Westerbork, a transit camp designed not for life, but for waiting. Waiting for the trains that carried human beings to annihilation. Westerbork, located in the northeast of the country, had once been built to house Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. By 1942, it had been transformed into a staging ground for deportation. From here, each week, trains left for Auschwitz, Sobibor, and other killing centers. When the Franks and their companions arrived in August 1944, Westerbork was already overcrowded. Barbed wire surrounded wooden barracks. Floodlights lit the night sky. Roll calls dragged on for hours. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor, but Westerbork was not a death camp, it was a way station to death. The Frank family was initially spared immediate deportation. Because they had been discovered in hiding, they were classified as criminals. This meant temporary detention in Westerbork's punishment barracks, where conditions were harsher than in the rest of the camp. Still, even here, Anne's spirit did not collapse. Survivors recalled her attempts to stay hopeful, to encourage others. She cared for children, spoke with energy, and clung to a fragile belief in survival. But around them, despair reigned. Every Tuesday, lists were posted, the names of those selected for deportation on the next train east. For those whose names appeared, it was the end. For those whose names did not, it was only a postponement. The trains left regularly, each carrying hundreds of Jews to Auschwitz or Sobibor. Few would ever return. Westerbork was not the final destination. It was the waiting room of death, a place where families clung to hope even as they lived in the shadow of the transports. For Anne Frank, that shadow was growing darker. On September 3, 1944, their names appeared on the list. It was the last transport to leave Westerbork for Auschwitz. Over 1,000 men, women, and children were crammed into cattle cars. Among them, Otto, Edith, Margot, and Anne Frank. The journey from Westerbork to Auschwitz lasted 3 days. Locked inside the stifling wagons, with no food, little water, and no room to move, they traveled deeper into occupied Poland. When the train doors opened, they would step out into the very heart of the Nazi machinery of murder. On September 6, 1944, the train from Westerbork reached its destination. The sliding doors opened, and the Frank family stepped out into the nightmarish world of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest killing center in Nazi-occupied Europe. The camp was a city of death. Watchtowers pierced the horizon. Barbed wire stretched as far as the eye could see. Smoke drifted from the chimneys of the crematoria, carrying the ashes of those who had already perished. And Frank, only 15 years old, was thrust into this world of industrialized murder. Upon arrival, families were separated by force. Men on one side, women on the other. It was the last time Otto Frank would see his wife and daughters. Edith, Margot, and Anne were pushed into the women's column. Otto, bewildered but powerless, disappeared into the crowd of men. The infamous selection followed. SS doctors stood at the ramp, casually deciding who would live and who would die. The elderly, the sick, mothers with small children, sent directly to the gas chambers. Those deemed fit for labor were spared, at least temporarily. Anne, Margot, and Edith were selected for work. They were herded into barracks, their identities stripped away, replaced with numbers. Their heads were shaved. Their clothes replaced with thin striped uniforms. Hunger and filth became their daily companions. Life in the women's camp was a battle for survival. Forced labor, endless roll calls in freezing weather, brutal punishments for the smallest infractions. Food consisted of watery soup and stale bread, never enough to stave off starvation. Disease spread quickly, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Anne and Margot clung to each other. Witnesses later recalled Anne's courage, her attempts to support her sister even in despair. Edith Frank, weakened by exhaustion, gave what little food she had to her daughters. All around them, death was constant. The gas chambers operated daily, burning with terrifying efficiency. Trucks carried the sick and the weak to their end. The stench of burning bodies filled the air. Auschwitz was not simply a camp. It was a factory of death, designed to erase entire peoples. It was the culmination of a system that reduced human beings to ash and smoke, and Anne Frank was now caught inside its machinery. For 2 months, the Frank women endured. And then, in October 1944, Anne and Margot were placed on a transport list once again. This time, not eastward, but westward, to Bergen-Belsen, another camp in northern Germany. It was not a reprieve. It was another chapter in suffering. And Frank had survived Auschwitz. But the place that would claim her life was still to come. Bergen-Belsen. A camp where hunger, filth, and disease would finish what Auschwitz had begun. In late October 1944, Bergen-Belsen was originally a prisoner of war camp. By 1943, it had been transformed into a holding site for Jews intended for exchange with German prisoners abroad. But as the war dragged on, it became a dumping ground, crammed with Jews from across Europe, abandoned to die slowly without gas chambers, but with equal certainty. When Anne and Margot arrived, the camp was already overwhelmed. Tens of thousands of prisoners lived in filth and squalor. Wooden barracks, designed for a few hundred, were packed with thousands. The ground was covered in mud and excrement. There was no running water, no sanitation, no medicine. Food rations were almost non-existent, watery soup, a crust of bread. Disease thrived in the filth. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis swept through the camp like wildfire. For Anne and Margot, survival became impossible. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing the sisters together, emaciated and exhausted, their hair shaved, their eyes dulled by fever. Yet Anne was still recognized by fellow prisoners for her tenderness, helping Margot, trying to find scraps of hope in a place designed to extinguish it. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, a typhus epidemic consumed Bergen-Belsen. Thousands died every week. Among them were Anne and Margot Frank. The exact dates of their deaths are unknown. Witnesses remembered only that Margot fell first, weak from disease. She collapsed from her bunk, never to rise again. Anne, already feverish and broken, followed shortly after. She was 15 years old. By April 1945, when British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen, more than 13,000 unburied corpses lay scattered across the camp. Among those nameless dead were 2 sisters from Amsterdam, whose voices had been silenced, but not erased. The Nazis did not shoot in Frank, nor did they march her into a gas chamber. They murdered her through starvation, disease, and neglect, through a system designed to strip away humanity until life itself collapsed. And Frank's death was not an accident of war. It was the inevitable consequence of a machinery built for annihilation. In January 1945, the gates of Auschwitz were opened by advancing Soviet troops. What they found was a wasteland of corpses, barracks filled with the dying, and mountains of human belongings, silent witnesses to the millions who had been erased. Among the few survivors was Otto Frank, a man who had lost everything but his life. Otto had endured the unimaginable. Separated from Edith, Margot, and then upon arrival at Auschwitz, he never saw them again. He survived forced labor, hunger, and the bitter cold of a Polish winter. By liberation, he was frail and broken, weighing barely a fraction of his former self. In the months that followed, Otto began the long journey home. He returned first to liberated Poland, then to the Netherlands. Each stop carried a faint hope that perhaps Edith, or Margot, or Anne might have survived elsewhere. When Otto finally reached Amsterdam in the summer of 1945, his search ended. One by one, survivors brought him fragments of the truth. Edith had died in Auschwitz. Margot and Anne had perished in Bergen-Belsen, just weeks before liberation. His daughters were gone. His wife was gone. He alone remained. For a time, Otto was consumed by silence. The weight of grief was almost unbearable. But then, a gift was placed in his hands. Miep Gies, the devoted helper who had risked her life to protect the annex, had returned to the ransacked hiding place after the arrests. There, on the floor, she found Anne's red and white checkered diary, along with notebooks and loose pages. She had gathered them, hoping to one day return them to Anne herself. Now, she gave them to Otto. At first, Otto could not bring himself to read the words. When he did, he discovered not only the thoughts of his young daughter, but the voice of a writer far beyond her years. Anne's diary spoke of quarrels and confessions, of hope and despair. It revealed a child growing into a young woman under extraordinary circumstances. Most of all, it revealed a spirit unbroken, even in the darkest of times. Through her words, Otto found his daughter again. In her voice, he found a reason to live. And in her testimony, he found a mission, to share Anne's words with the world, so that what happened to her would never be forgotten. In 1947, with Otto's efforts, Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, was published in Dutch. What began as a teenager's private diary soon became one of the most powerful testimonies of the Holocaust. Otto Frank lived the rest of his life carrying both grief and responsibility, the grief of a father who had lost his family, and the responsibility of a survivor entrusted with the voice of his daughter. Otto Frank survived. But survival was not victory. For him, survival meant remembrance. And through remembrance, Anne Frank's voice would never be silenced again. What began as the private confessions of a teenage girl in hiding became one of the most powerful voices of the 20th century. The diary Anne Frank left behind is not only literature, it is testimony. It is memory. It is proof. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, Otto Frank arranged for the first edition of his daughter's diary to be published in Dutch under the title Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex. Only a few thousand copies were printed. Yet even in its modest beginnings, readers recognized the extraordinary power of Anne's words. Soon, translations appeared in French, German, English. By the 1950s, the diary of Anne Frank had reached an international audience. It was adapted for the stage in New York and later for the screen. Critics hailed it as one of the most important personal accounts of the Holocaust. But its impact went beyond literature. For millions, the diary gave a face and a voice to an unfathomable tragedy. Anne's words humanized the statistics of genocide. Her dreams, her quarrels, her first love, her reflections on humanity, they reminded the world that behind every number was a life, a family, a story. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, when the sheer scale of murder defied comprehension, Anne Frank's diary offered something personal, something intimate. It invited readers not to imagine 6 million dead, but to imagine one girl. And in imagining her, to understand the loss of them all. The diary also sparked controversy. Some critics questioned whether its hopeful passages, Anne's declaration that she still believed in the goodness of people, softened the reality of Nazi barbarity. Others dismissed it as too innocent to convey the true horror of the Holocaust. Still others, driven by anti-Semitism, falsely claimed it was a forgery. Otto Frank responded with dignity and determination. He defended the authenticity of the diary, presenting original manuscripts as proof. More importantly, he insisted that Anne's voice, innocent, imperfect, unfinished, was exactly what made the diary so powerful. Over the decades, The Diary of Anne Frank became one of the most translated and widely read books in the world. It is studied in classrooms from Amsterdam to Tokyo, from New York to Cape Town. The house where Anne hid was transformed into a museum, drawing millions of visitors each year. For survivors of the Holocaust, the diary was both painful and necessary. Painful, because it revealed the cruelty of loss. Necessary, because it preserved memory when so many voices were erased. The diary is not simply Anne Frank's story. It is the story of a world that failed her. It is a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both its darkest depths and its enduring capacity for hope. To ask how the Nazis murdered Anne Frank is not to search for a single moment of death, but to examine an entire system designed to destroy her from the very beginning. Her murder was not an act of chance. It was the outcome of laws, policies, betrayals, and indifference that stripped away her life step by step. The murder of Anne Frank began long before Bergen-Belsen. It began when a government declared Jews unfit to live as equals. When laws expelled her from school, when stars were sewn onto coats, when neighbors turned their heads away. It continued in July 1942, when deportation orders arrived in Amsterdam. When the Franks went into hiding, they were not escaping justice, but injustice. For 2 years, Anne wrote in secret because the world outside had been made lethal to her existence. It advanced on August 4, 1944, when betrayal ripped open the annex. The Nazis did not fire a gun, but in placing Anne and her family on that transport, they condemned them to a machinery of destruction already perfected. It deepened at Westerbork, where she lived in limbo, and at Auschwitz, where her humanity was reduced to a number, her survival dependent on labor, hunger, and the random mercy of selections. And it concluded at Bergen-Belsen, where starvation, filth, and typhus became the final weapons. No firing squad. No bullet. Just neglect and cruelty, calculated by a regime that saw no need to waste ammunition on those already condemned to die. The Nazis murdered Anne Frank through a process that was at once methodical and impersonal. They did not kill her because of what she did, but because of who she was, a Jewish girl, one among millions. Her death was not extraordinary. That is what makes it unbearable. Yet within this system, Anne's diary forces us to see the individual. She was not a statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a dreamer, a writer. Her voice reminds us of the millions whose names and words are lost forever. Her murder was systemic, but her memory is singular. To understand how the Nazis murdered Anne Frank is to understand how they murdered 6 million others, not in one blow, but in the slow dismantling of life, humanity, and hope, until only silence remained. Anne Frank's life ended in silence, but her words did not. In the pages of a simple diary, hidden behind a bookcase, she left behind more than thoughts and dreams. She left behind testimony. A record of innocence destroyed, of hope tested, of humanity betrayed. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, they found chaos and death. Piles of bodies lay unburied. Survivors, too weak to stand, reached out with hollow eyes. Amid this horror, Anne and Margot Frank were gone. Their lives had been extinguished just weeks before freedom arrived. And yet, through her diary, Anne's voice endured. A teenager who never reached adulthood spoke across decades, across languages, across continents. She spoke for herself, and, though she could not have known, for millions who left no words behind. Her words remind us that genocide is not an abstract force. It begins with laws, with lies, with prejudice. It grows in silence, in the failure of neighbors to act, in the apathy of those who look away. And Frank's story is not only a story of the past. It is a warning. A reminder of what can happen when hatred is normalized, when difference is dehumanized, when entire peoples are declared unworthy of life. Her diary closes with one of the most haunting lines ever written: "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are truly good at heart." Those words challenge us. They force us to ask, what do we do with the hope of a girl murdered at 15? How do we honor a voice silenced by hate, but determined to speak beyond death? We honor it by remembering. By refusing to forget not only Anne Frank, but the 6 million whose names we will never know. By teaching their stories, by challenging hatred, by protecting the humanity of every child who dares to dream of a future. The Nazis murdered Anne Frank. But they could not kill her words. They could not erase her voice. And they could not prevent her from speaking to us still, across time, reminding us that memory is both a burden and a responsibility. Her diary is not just the story of one girl. It is a mirror. And what we see reflected in it is not only the past, but the choices we make in the present. Anne Frank's life was cut short. But her voice refused to die.